right, so what's on the agenda for today's discussion? I tried to shorten it as much as I can and just stay to the raw data and stats. Today we're talking about recent settlements, the economy. Please don't shoot the messenger, please. That's the message I have. It's not my fault, it's the messenger, okay? And then other workforce updates. We'll talk about trends and constants that have been going on this year. All right, so as you can see, recent data updated shows where wages are falling for 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. And by the way, a copy of this will be provided to you afterward too. And then a newsletter will be coming out as soon as the federal government releases a few more stats at the end of the month. So you can anticipate that as well. But let's see where we're falling. In 2021, the average was 2.56. We've seen an uptick to 2.8, and then it's predicted 305 in 2023 and 301. But how many of these wages are going to interest arbitration? And don't mind me, I'm wandering, sorry, in advance. It's a consistent trend that this year, unions are not taking municipalities to interest arbitration over wages. We've seen less of them going to interest arbitration. And part of that is, right now, well, this is speculation, but part of it could be, right, that they have an economy that's in their favor for the wages that they're asking. And so, when they come to the table with more reasonable proposals, when I say reasonable in their perspective, they're actually more in line with what the economy is demanding anyway. But you'll find it interesting that a recent award, the union asked for a 2% general. And this is a wage increase. This is not steps. This is a wage increase to the table. And they also asked for a 2.5 market. And that is an interesting situation. You probably have to wonder, how does that play out with arbitrators? Right? Because you're basically asking for just a bigger general. It's the same concept. You're just getting an adjustment to the wages. Well, the arbitrator sided with the city, who asked for a 2% increase. And so the market argument, albeit in this one case, because there's not many going to interest arbitration, settled in favor of the city. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there may be an argument that a general wage increase, nonetheless, is the only wage increase that we should be discussing if we're going to interest arbitration. There's no reason to compound with a bunch of different types of adjustments when they're already having to deal with step increases. So what is my recommendation is to avoid a discussion of a market increase. What I usually tell clients is, when you're at the bargaining table, you actually want to avoid as much as possible even using the term COLA, or cost of living adjustment, because that ties bargaining to the economy. But we're not here to tie bargaining to the economy. We're here to talk about the contract and the contract adjustment. Once you start talking about the economy, that opens up the conversation for things like market adjustments. And you're like, Nico, you sound like a cheapskate. It's like, well, well, one, that's why I'm here to help you through. But two, our interest arbitrators seem to agree that we're only talking about one type of adjustment, generally. Okay, wait, down is right? Yeah. Thanks. All right, and let's see where health insurance is falling. I feel kind of bad. I'm neglecting this side of the room. So I'll come visit you over here for a little bit. I'll give you a chance to take a look at the table. Again, this will be distributed to you. I wanted to just focus on 2022 and 2023 because that is what we're starting to feel. I know that a lot of you have recently been in touch with your insurance carriers, and some of you have had large jumps in the years prior. And so I wanted to show you how that's reflecting on the contribution side and how it's predicted, or how it's playing out contractually. So we have, for single coverage, city contribution, what's more common, there was a slide I wanted to, I wanted to also recommend, before I touch base on the actual, what's in the contracts and how much cities are contributing. It's important, if you can, to start bargaining out percentages in the contract. Because once you're tied to a percentage of your contribution, you're going to be stuck with that for a long time, especially with inflation having a large impact on health insurance. It is best to just put straight dollars, if anything. And if you can't get, the union will go by whatever insurance non-union employees go by. If you can't get that, then what you want to do is try to negotiate out specific percentages. Because let's say right now it's a $900 contribution, and in a couple of years it's a $1,500 contribution per single. I'm just going out random numbers, and you're still stuck with a percentage of that, right? So if you can, and while you're bargaining, try to get away from the employer will contribute 80%, 75% of total premiums. That's an uphill battle, but I think we know that with the current disposition of the economy, it is probably a necessity to start reevaluating the health insurance language in the contract. Because as we all know, health insurance is a large part of the compensation package for our employees, and it's incredibly expensive. You'll hear right after this about, in our duty disability presentation, health insurance is expensive. So, I lost my remote. Here it is. All right. So, some of these are not going to be surprised because a lot of you have already been at the bargaining table so far this fall. But I did want to just capture some of the trends that we've been seeing so far. So there is a larger increase in general wages. It is not quite at the level of inflation. If it were, that would be really hard for a lot of municipalities to digest right now. So it's not quite there, but we are seeing them trend higher. More cities, a lot more cities, are looking at doing comp studies, trying to stay competitive, especially in a tight labor market where it's hard to recruit and retain employees. You know, especially a lot of northern Minnesota clients have spoken to me about wanting to reevaluate their structure because they're just not sure it's competitive. One community has been trying to recruit a city administrator for a year. And so we're in a tight job market. And so we've seen an uptick in cities wanting to do more market studies. We've seen more external and internal equity pay adjustments. And with reason, right, when you go to an arbitrator, one of the arguments that you have to consider is what does internal equity dictate? The other thing is, where are your comparables at? You know, if you do a valid market study, well, one, you want to have a good, competent market study, right, that tells you where you should be benchmarked. Because that will help you recruit and retain employees, especially if someone can go to a comparable community and earn more money. So you do want to be benchmarked appropriately. But right, the argument is, from the city side, well, these are our comparables. This is where we're benchmarked. If we go beyond this, you know, we may run into issues of pay equity. We may, you know, we may not be able to afford that workforce on our, based on the resources that we have financially in our, you know, in our municipality. Well, what are some things? Other things that we've seen as, I like to call them cookies. So I'll try not to go on a tangent. But like when I'm negotiating, we try to reserve all the cookies for when we get to the end. We're talking about economics. Just push them a little closer to just saying yes to the end goal, right? Having a reasonable wage adjustment. And so we try to think, what are those cookies? Some communities have considered performance pay, like a lump sum or a base pay increase, education, sign-on lump sum payments, and retention lump sum payments as long-term cookies to kind of convince the union to be more amenable to the city's economic proposal. And these might be very valuable tools right now when we are in such a volatile economy, and inflation rate is way too high for us to compete with right now in terms of the adjustment that we can offer. So these might be very valuable resources. Some other programs that I wanted to mention too. And again, you'll have the PowerPoint. And so I recommend that you take a look at these and consider what may be manageable cookies. Cookies might be too big. They might be small enough. So other ones include tuition reimbursement, technology, paid family medical leave, and we're going to come back to that as another tidbit anyway at the end of the presentation. On what's on the horizon. Sorry, not to give spoilers. Enhancements to paid time off, voluntary insurances, wellness programs, flexible work arrangements. And in especially in the public sector versus the private sector, right? Flexible arrangements are just emerging. And a lot of that is due to the operational necessity of our municipalities, and we have constraints that the private sector doesn't necessarily have constraints. Someone has to be there to answer to a public resident. So, I mean, we know there's all these different factors that contribute to why flexible work schedules are now just emerging. But if in situations where you can find them to be reasonable, they may be a very valuable tool because we see, at least in the private sector, and I'm not going to talk about the private sector too much, but just we see, at least in the private sector, that a lot of employees will even take a pay cut for a remote job. Now, we don't necessarily face the same circumstances in the public sector because there's different aspects to consider, like you are in the public sector because you want to provide a public service to your residents. You're in it for different reasons. But we do see this starting to emerge in the public sector, and this might be an interesting policy to consider. If you don't need to do it in negotiations, I would actually recommend you start off with, in your policy handbooks, because that could be a unilateral change, right? So if you want to pilot some of these things and test them out, let me clarify, you don't want to do it necessarily in the union environment, because once you do that, then you have to start bargaining over it. So, as I said earlier, I'm sure what you've seen, can I take a poll? How many of you are in the midst of bargaining right now? Okay. And how many of your unions have come to the table asking about a market increase? Okay, so a good amount. That's my reminder that I'm here. That is what we're seeing, right? We're seeing that argument that they want to be caught up with the economy instead of asking for a general wage increase, and I don't usually call it a general wage increase. They frame it as a general wage increase and then a market adjustment. Now, of course, market adjustments happen. Let's not pretend they don't. When you do a comp study, right, you get benchmarked, you may do a market adjustment. Well, now we see unions coming more often to the table, asking to have that market adjustment represented, but they're not coming to the table necessarily with a full market study having been done. They're going off of inflation, CPI. They're going off of some Bureau of Labor Statistics data. So it's not necessarily the same, it's not a true market adjustment proposal that you would normally consider, because what you would consider if you're doing a market adjustment is where you're benchmarked in your comparable communities. And then we see different this might be in line with retaining, public sector unions definitely want to retain their members in the public sector. But they don't want them to go to the private sector where they have some of these benefits already. And so you'll see in your union proposals there's different ask for specialty pay for weekend work, technology usage, different special assignments, and that's been more common with police officers for decades. But we're now seeing that emerge with even non-public safety, in the non-public safety environment. And then we see more about paid time off. For example, I've had, every bargaining session I've had so far, Juneteenth has been asked for to be bargained into the agreement. But not only that, what I've seen more commonly is an ask to have a floating holiday. And there is merit, right, to the concept of, well, I'm not of the same religion of the holidays that are listed here. And that is a very valid point. What's troublesome is then you have just the individuals who already have that established holiday that aligns with their religion now get an additional floating holiday. So there is trouble reconciling that and finding a solution that would, honestly create some equity, but without still favoring, one group more over the other. And so I've seen that become more common this past year. But again, it's very hard to reconcile a solution to that problem. What we've seen is a constant, a overall weakening in the economy. Again, so shoot the messenger, please. I hope I don't get any tomatoes thrown at me, right? So we see, I'm going to go through the forecast. We have, as of February, it was forecasted that we'd be at, 3.7%. And now, as of October, that number is looking more like 1.7, which is slightly above what was forecasted in July. So we're seeing that the economy is becoming less volatile, I will say, more predictable. And I'll go into why that may be. There's actually very intentional policy going into creating that more structure in the economy. But we do see the effects of that in 2023. When you look at what was originally forecasted in February, now we're seeing a negative pointage. So, and I did include 2024 and 2025 just as a rough forecast, but that's so far out that I wouldn't, that could change drastically, right? Because just since February, we went from 3.7 to 1.7. But at least to give you an idea of what it has been forecasted for 2023 and 2025. I wanted to provide you with those numbers. Re-echoing the bad news. Growth forecast has weakened, right, since February. And in different parts, even as of July, it has weakened. And the intentional policy that I was talking about comes down from the feds, or some call it FOMC. So overall, the weakened disposition of our economy has been attributed to three factors. we see a higher than anticipated acceleration in inflation in the month of August that had led to the Feds increasing the federal funding rate by 75 basis points, 0.75, whatever it recently was. And then it was made clear by the Feds that they will fight inflation even at the risk of a recession. Now, let me put a caveat on that, because what I've been reviewing from economists and from the state departments is that, yes, they are going to implement policy at the risk that it may cause in a recession, but they're not talking about a 2008 recession. They're talking about a 3/4 long of a year recession. So we're not, the Feds are not necessarily saying we're going to put us in a 2008 situation, right? Because that's the whole point of this policy being implemented, is to make sure that doesn't happen again. And so that's why we're seeing the federal fund rates going up, because they're trying to curb inflation. At the risk of having a smaller recession compared to, if they don't do anything, having a massive crash in the economy. So in response, naturally, to this policy, because this is the purpose, we've seen that the financial market conditions have tightened. So we see that stocks and bond prices have fallen, the dollar has appreciated, and then the spreads between treasuries and private bonds, those have widened. And I lost the remote again. Sorry, hold on. Just bad news after bad news after bad news, huh? So here I wanted to show you what the actual change was. I said 75 basis points. So we see in July 2027 we were at 2.5% was the rate for federal funding, and then it went to 3.25, and now it's predicted to be 4. So actually earlier this year, the predicted rates for 2023, so I just want to be forthcoming, that was predicted to be at 3%. But now we're in November 2022 and we're already at 4%. But again, we all work in government, we work with governments. So this is a policy implemented, right, to curb the inflation. So it's a process. So these numbers are daunting, but it has been communicated that these are to curb a massive recession. So in a more pessimistic scenario, we see GDP growing at 1.3% in 2022 at the end, and then in 2023 being negative 0.3. Now, I find it somewhat interesting. It was predicted back in July that we would be at negative 0.4. Well, you go, that's like not much of a difference. Well, we're talking billions and billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. It makes a difference in what policy or programs are going to be scrapped or not. And we saw, we're at 1.3 versus what was predicted in July being 1.4. So compared to how the other trends have quickly devolved, when we're talking about GDP, this one seems to be slightly more stable to the other figures I've been showing you. And a lot of this is attributed to, again, this has been a constant this entire year. The Russian-Ukraine conflict has consistently attributed to the economic issues that we've been facing this year. We've also seen slower resolution of existing supply chain issues. Growth in consumer spending and business fixed investment has diminished and is anticipated to diminish in 2023. So, aren't you all happy you're starting me off on Friday morning? Yeah. Okay, let me just skip over this part. But in a more optimistic scenario, we're looking at a 1.8% at the end of 2022, and we're looking at a 1.6 in 2023. And what's attributed to this is, in an optimistic scenario, a quicker resolution to the Russian-Ukraine conflict, the consumer spending and business fixed investment exhibits stronger growth, and then the price of oil remains below the baseline assumption from mid-2022. So these are, and well, also I wanted to mention that stronger consumer and business response to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So these are all factors that economists are hopeful will kind of level out the economic growth toward the end of the year and into 2023. So, how does this manifest in the employment world? Well, we're still seeing record lows in unemployment. With that comes a very tight job economy, a very competitive job economy, especially in the public sector. But nonetheless, right, we're still seeing low unemployment, but we're seeing high turnover. And why is that? Well, that's in part is due to the competitive environment that we're in, right? And so you see, like I said, individuals now in a post-pandemic, but still the pandemic lingering. We see in this new world that remote work is really a really important consideration for individuals in the job that they choose to work. And that's been more common in the private sector. But that has certainly contributed to high turnover rate. We've also seen an increase in wages as a trend. Well, so we will see individuals going from one job to another where they can be hired by an entity or a private organization that can afford them. So these are all factors that contribute to high turnover in a low unemployment environment. So as of October, the unemployment rate was 2.1. And last year at this time, in October, even 3.1% is a good figure. So we're seeing it, and we're seeing that we're continuing to exhibit historic unemployment rates. That has been a consistent trend despite the economic hardships that we've been facing this fall and through the summer. Overall, we are we're comparing